reform in Scotland. The session today will explore key land reform issues in urban Scotland, looking at opportunities, and it's also a chance to reflect on where we are now in terms of our land reform journey and discuss what changes are still needed to ensure that Scotland's urban land is used, owned and managed in a way that delivers wider public value and benefits. So I'm really pleased to be joined today by three experts in their fields: Hanna Wheatley, who's a Senior Economist at Future Economy Scotland, Ewan Leach, Chief Executive of Scotland's Regeneration Forum, and Carey Doyle, who's a Research Associate at Scotland's Rural College. But of course, as I said, we want to hear from you, so please do participate in the polls and discussion towards the end. So I'm now going to turn to our first panellist, Hanna, and I have a question to kick things off. So your work both in Future Economy Scotland and at the Scottish Land Commission has identified housing market failure as causes of the housing crisis. I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on ways that land reform could address this problem? Over to you.
Thanks, Kathy. And yeah, as Kathy alluded to there, before I joined Future Economy Scotland, I was a researcher at the Scottish Land Commission. So I'll be answering that with sort of two hats on in some ways. Both organisations have identified that although the roots of Scotland's housing crises, and I say crises because they're multiple and they're very specific and local, are complex and multifaceted, we've identified that a dysfunctional land market has played a significant role in that. And to understand that, it's useful to look backwards a little bit, and as well as looking at how things are now. Looking backwards, throughout much of the 20th century, large-scale public house building programmes, together with the ability to acquire land at low cost, was effective at keeping supply up and housing costs affordable in Scotland. But since the state has retreated from playing such a proactive role in the land market, Scotland has relied on speculative private developers to meet housing need. Scotland's not alone in that. Lots of other countries have followed similar suit. However, there are some really fundamental reasons that that model of development has been unable to create the scale and type of housing provision and sort of place-based building that we need. And this isn't going to be a kind of speech bashing private developers. There are two sort of real fundamental reasons for this. One is that private developers have to provide returns to shareholders, and therefore they have to act in ways that maximise returns. And number two is that increasing land prices, which are one of the biggest components of the cost of housing, mean that private developers have to make a profit over and above what they've paid for land. So this leads to a set of actions that I would argue are bad for housing and place building. Firstly, private developers are forced to sort of prioritise markets that provide the biggest return and most certain return. So that means focusing on developing larger detached houses in high value areas, for example, cities, while neglecting rural and regeneration areas, as well as homes aimed at specific groups like younger people and older people. They also avoid risky sites. So in Scotland, we've got a big problem with vacant and derelict land, and private developers avoid risk because they need to maximise returns. And so those sites are often seen as too risky to deal with, and so remain derelict. And private developers are also incentivised to release homes onto the market slowly, basically in order to avoid putting downward pressure on house prices, which means that they would struggle to increase the pace of delivery even if they really wanted to. And so that leads to this conclusion, which is actually from a Land Commission report, that commercial house builders are set up in a way that preserves rather than reduces house prices and hence affordability. So both Future Economy and the Land Commission have identified that delivering the affordable homes that Scotland needs in the places that need it therefore requires a sort of bold new public-led approach to development. And we're not, we wouldn't be alone in that. There are lessons from around the world, as well as from Scotland's own history, that indicate that development is more effectively delivered when the state plays a more proactive role in the land market and in shaping the kinds of things that we're seeing, the kinds of places that we're building. So two policy proposals I'll just mention briefly that would enable this related to land reform, both of which are included in our recent report setting out our priorities for the 2026 Scottish election, which I'm hoping Scarlett might be able to put a link two in the chat. Firstly, the creation of a new Scottish land agency with the power to purchase, develop and sell land. That's been proposed by us at Future Economy, by the Land Commission, also by the Land Reform Review Group in 2014 and many others. It wouldn't replace private developers, but would act as a kind of prime mover in the market, working in partnership with local authorities, small and medium-sized house builders, landowners and citizens to ensure that basically enough land is being brought forward to deliver the sorts of housing and infrastructure and things that we need. The agency would be empowered to acquire land at a low cost, and unlike private developers, a public land agency would basically be acquiring and assembling land with social value in mind rather than profit, which would enable it to prioritise affordable housing, better placemaking, green space, all of those things. The second one I'll just mention briefly, because I know I don't have long here, is introducing compulsory sales orders, which would essentially require an owner to sell a piece of long-term vacant or derelict land via a public auction, opening up opportunities for new owners to bring the site back into use. In reality, it's quite likely that the CSO, compulsory sales order power, wouldn't need to be used extensively because the even idea of it existing would create a kind of shift in the incentives for the owners of vacant and derelict land in a kind of use it or lose it dilemma. And so it could be a really useful tool that, wouldn't require sort of upfront public spending as well, because it would just involve running the auction. So that's just two sort of provocation ideas to kick off. They're two ideas that would, reform the land market to change the way that housing is delivered in Scotland, shifting to a more public-led rather than market-driven approach to ensure that this very key and vital resource is being managed strategically and in the public interest.
Great, thanks so much, Hannah. And I was wondering how long it would take for compulsory sales orders to make an appearance. That was really insightful, and I'm sure we can pick up on some of those issues later on. So we'll now move on to Ewan, and your kickoff question is: climate change is a main concern for land reform, but how might land reform support communities to play a full and active role in shaping responses to the climate emergency to facilitate a just transition? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. And in response to the question, I suppose I should preempt it by saying SRUC is interested in the most deprived and most marginalised communities in Scotland being at the heart of decision making and managing what happens around them. That doesn't necessarily mean ownership, which may give you an indication of the direction that I'm going. And when it comes to climate change, I suppose from SRUC's perspective, we may not talk about carbon a lot at SRUC because we're interested in people having warm homes that are affordable to run. And the same with the natural environment. The people who live in communities carbon or the increase of carbon may not be high on their list of priorities when they have really fundamental needs not being met within their lives. But they are concerned with food provision and community. And we would see the community food growing network that exists within Scotland as one of the kind of vital ways that local communities are meeting climate change agenda, be that through mitigation, through the fact that they're planting things or they're creating natural networks and improving local ecologies and a network of local ecologies in some instances. But primarily their interest is possibly in the provision of food. And then the things that arise around the provision of food and creating community cohesion, integrating new communities within areas that are under stress. And these are the two areas that we see most interest, which intersect with, I suppose, climate change and the natural environment and responding to climate change issues. And the barriers that we are aware of through members within our network are not necessarily ownership of land, it is access to land. And within some of these communities, there's not a desire to own the land because of responsibilities that may come with that. They just want to access land to be able to grow food on that. This is in urban and non-urban areas. But there seem to be repeated barriers in gaining access to that land. One of the reasons that we're particularly interested in this is in the Good Food Nation agenda within Scotland. And I suppose if you have a look at the National Preparedness Commission, which may appear in the link to the side, the need for community food growing and what that can mean for a resilient nation as well as resilient communities in the face of the fact that, from my perspective, climate change is going to happen. We're not acting fast enough, and we need to be resilient in providing food for us at an immediate level rather than relying on the rest of the world to supply us with food. But in talking to some of our network members, particularly Grow Green Scotland, who I had a meeting with this morning, they would say that about 80% of their inquiries come from people who are looking to access public land and are experiencing barriers in accessing public land. And there seems to be a barrier within local authorities and enterprise agencies in making land available for communities. Sometimes communities are offered land maybe for a 1 or 2 year lease, which is kind of a bit meaningless in terms of substantively changing community food growing and meeting climate change agenda. And local authorities, there are barriers within them with the siloization of departments where really great individuals within local authorities want to release land that is currently unused, but other parts of local authorities view them as future potential income generators, not now, and also may be seeking rent on them, which are prohibitive to local communities, particularly those within deprived areas. And so there's fundamentally a need for culture change within local authorities, which we all know. There are many, many bits of research that look at what that means. And it is challenging because the individuals who have individual legal responsibilities for a part of the council are not necessarily connected to each other. But that is one of the areas that we are seeing huge barriers. And I think some of you may have been to the community garden and wider network that's been created at Took in Dunfermline. And we know that initially within the local authority there, Fife wanted to charge them about £1,000 a year for renting a small proportion of land. Ultimately, through some internal negotiation within the council, that was overcome. But there is a wide variety of approaches and responses across local authorities. That's great that we have variety, but the variety is resulting in huge barriers for some communities, and particularly communities that are already maybe experiencing barriers connected to poverty within their own space. On top of that, there are things that can possibly be done that would make it easier for communities to deliver community food growing that other parts of national government could address. For instance, polytunnels, etc., being part of permitted development rights or acknowledged as agricultural development so that they can then develop more easily, so they don't have to go through the whole planning process for that, which would make it easier at community level. And as one of the interesting things that if anybody's paying attention to the UK planning bill that's currently going through, one of the amendments that is in there is around local authorities in providing a strategic plan have to provide for a policy on allotments, but also on community gardens as well to make sure that's featured in it. And I would say further than that, I suppose there is a local authority level, there's probably a need for community growing space to be identified in master plans because of the extent of new development that we are seeing on the edge of a number of places where there isn't space for that being provided. It's a new community, so there isn't a community there yet to demand it. It's already difficult to retrofit our existing communities with community growing space. But as we expand our urban footprint, if we're continuing to sprawl and not doing density, and even if we are doing density, we need to provide space within those new areas to make sure that community growing is possible. And that requires it probably to be led by local authorities as well. But beneath all of this and within the wider community land agenda, the community land agenda and community empowerment looks fantastic externally. But I think all of us know that it doesn't work beautifully or perfectly on the ground. And some of the reasons around that are resource. The resource in delivering it, the process of going through asset transfer or long-term lease for communities is onerous. And there isn't a huge amount of resource for the community to do it. But there's also not a lot of resource within the local authorities to help to deliver those things. So the local authorities themselves are hamstrung because of their own internal lack of capacity. So any suggestions that we have as a group, new policies are lovely. We are awash with lovely policy, but we are not awash with resource to deliver those policies. And it's the resource, the community and human resource to make sure those policies are delivered both within a local authority and having a community person on the ground to make sure those policies are delivered in place.
Great, thanks, Ian. A lot in there to unpack, and I'm sure resource will come up a fair amount in the chat as well. Thank you. Moving on to Carey, I have a question for you as well, which is your work has examined community land ownership in urban Scotland, particularly in lower income neighbourhoods. What do you think land reform can do to support and empower urban communities and address inequality?
Thanks, Kathy. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for that, and in particular, that's a great kickoff for what I'm about to say, and I think we're about to have a really interesting conversation about things. So I'm a researcher at Scotland's Royal College, and over the last 5 years, my work has focused on Scottish land reform and community land ownership, including leading a Community Land Scotland's Urban Action Research Project on community land ownership in the Clyde Valley. So if the question is what land reform can do to support and empower urban communities and address inequality, my response is anything it can do in rural Scotland. It's fundamental that we look across a barrier between urban and rural, in my opinion. And it's fundamental that land reform addresses urban issues. There's nothing in the Land Reform Bill for urban Scotland. There's no wider strategy for urban land reform. We need to remember that land reform includes a wide number of things. It's much more than community land ownership. It's property laws, it's regulatory laws about how land is used, and that includes the land use planning system, and non-statutory public measures like financial support. The Land Commission's work on topics including vacant and derelict land, land assembly, and compulsory sales orders are all quite important work on this. We need to start from understanding land reform widely and well beyond a focus on community land ownership, which is only one part of land reform, if a headline success for Scotland. Community land ownership, in fact, is only one type of land that's managed in the public interest. In Scotland, there's many different types across the nation, and in urban Scotland, this includes common good land. There's significantly variable practice in the management of common good land across urban areas. Did you know, for example, that Glasgow City Council's Common Good Fund was worth 20 million last year and spent over $500,000 on hospitality and management? That stat's is in the public accounts. The Commission's work on vacant and derelict land identified the impacts of these sites on urban communities, and in 2019, the statistic was 55% of the population in areas suffering from resource deprivation live within 500 meters of a derelict site. It's quite a stark statistic, that. And my question is, what impacts has the ongoing work on vacant and derelict land in terms of taking sites off the register, and which is often looked at as a success? What impact is that having on these areas? Who's benefiting from development to address vacant and derelict land sites? Are these reducing impacts on communities? Are they actually building community wealth? So turning then to the Clyde Valley work specifically, over 3 years, we supported over 110 groups who wanted help with proactive land projects when we're exploring community land ownership, and identified a wide range of challenges and recommendations to better support these groups proceed with their land projects, and we'll share a link about all of those recommendations. The majority of the groups who reached out for support were early stage and interested in exploring things, and they were in areas impacted by poverty, illustrating notable demand for taking things forward to address their challenges. And people in these areas can be really skilled at doing these types of projects, but there's a huge number of challenges. I'll give you another statistic on this level of demand. Since 2017, when urban communities became able to use community right to buy, 30% of community right to buy applications have been in urban areas. However, only 12% of buyouts are in urban areas. So what you're seeing is there's a demand to use these tools we have for land reform for people to address issues in their local communities, but that's not translating through to buyouts in the case of community land ownership. Community right to buy are interesting for a number of reasons, because and some of these are, the vast majority of these applications are for privately owned land. So we're not talking about asset transfer here. And community right to buy implements Scotland's unique land rights-based approach, evidencing clear demand for power and control over land by urban communities, if difficulty seeing that through to purchase. Some headlines from our work in the Clyde Valley was that urban community organizations are very interested in policy tools for being proactive over land in the public interest. These groups are frequently determined, and they often work on sites over decades, for a really long time. A great example of this in Glasgow is bowling greens, where many sites are in private trusts, but local people can be quite attached to them. Here, organizations and often individuals work collectively to express this land attachment through charrettes. Does anyone remember charrettes? Commenting on development plans, planning applications, signing short-term leases on these sites, creating local place plans, negotiating with private developers, and if they're very determined, putting in a community right to buy application for a first right of refusal. And let's not forget that in St. Andrews this year, we've had the first forced sale, community right to buy, which was on a derelict urban site with a proposal for a public garden, community garden. These success stories are long, difficult processes with little support, less support than in rural areas, with land ownership fragmentation complicating things and lack of land transparency on ownership and control, and widespread vacant and derelict land, all adding challenges. Community landowners are also, as in rural areas, stepping up to deliver public services, which can be very difficult for charities to do, particularly if they're taking on liabilities. We have to grapple with that process in terms of moving forward. The reduction and now winding up of the Scottish Land Fund underlines these challenges. It's my understanding that Land Fund is now closed to applications until after it being reintroduced after the election next year, and that it was worth $3 million this year. And if anyone on the call knows the details of that, please share them if I've got that wrong. So in 2025, without government action, without any type of action, we're at risk of putting community land ownership and community empowerment into a very difficult position. That would be an exceptionally bad missed opportunity. Does the focus on, and this I guess picks up some of the points that Ewan was making, does this focus on community land ownership and community empowerment itself, which is not realizing its own potential, also distract us from the wider land reform questions around land assembly, around reaching the big land reform goals that we write out? So concluding provocatively, I would say it's time for the next step in community empowerment and urban land reform. I've picked 3 headline suggestions for things we could do out of many more, by the way. I've got some on vacant and derelict land and land register completion, which we can talk about in the chat. I think that community land ownership processes widely should be reviewed for inclusion and to address poverty across urban and rural communities. There should be a new Scottish Land Fund. It needs to probably at least double to account for urban interest and the increase in land prices. There should be better support for communities impacted by poverty. For the Action Research Project, we proposed an early stage support system with the Land Fund, which provide more flexibility and support for early stage groups impacted by poverty, for example. Common good funds should support community empowerment. That's my provocative suggestion there. And should there potentially be an obligation in the community wealth building bill for that to be done? And finally, we need culture change in public bodies and to build political will. Instead of saving services, offloading liabilities, small charities remediating derelict sites and short-term leases, there needs to be a culture change to support the development of community wealth through land. That is me completed.
Great. So much in that to unpack as well. So this is your opportunity now to reflect, ask questions. We've already had some good comments in the chat, but we've just got a poll, our first of 2 polls, just to get things going. Who has the greatest untapped potential to drive urban land reform? And a list of different actors. So yeah, if you want to respond to that while we have a think about questions. So if you did want to ask a question to the panel, please do raise your hand and we'll bring you in. And it would be great if you could just briefly introduce yourself and also direct your question at a member of the panel, or all of them if that's the case. So we've got a good question here. I'll just start with Norrie McPhail's question. Can you please define how a community is defined within an urban area? As local authorities will run rings around you unless you actually live in the definition of a political zone. So I think there's something, about the definition of a community and how it applies in different contexts and whether that's potentially helpful in an urban land reform context. And I'll go for Carey maybe, yeah.
Well, I take that one, and the other speakers are welcome to come in as well. So community land ownership relies on this concept of communities of geography, which are place-based communities, which you can define on a map or in terms of postcodes or something like that. Our experience in the Clyde Valley was that urban communities were reasonably good at identifying their areas. They would generally know their local neighborhoods. It didn't tend to be a huge issue for communities. Asset transfer allows for communities of interest as well as communities of geography, which I suppose I don't study asset transfer, so I'm a little bit hesitant to get into all of that. In terms of the question specifically, there are different definitions that operate in policy for different types of approaches, which is a bit of a waffle, but I appreciate that. Would love to hear what attendees have to think about these different definitions.
Ewan, is there something you want to add to that?
No, but I would acknowledge that if communities of interest can sometimes have a higher, there's a barrier to them that doesn't exist for communities of place. I wouldn't say all communities of place are NIMBYs, but there is a challenge there. So, and the example that you put in, Nori, around co-housing is unlikely that everyone's going to live in the place that you're seeking to find co-housing in. So I do see it as a challenge that probably needs overcome. But like Kerry, I'm not an expert on the definition of communities within Community Empowerment Act.
Great. So there's a question here from David Aitchison at CELTA, really interesting one actually, sort of linking to public sector leadership. And I was going to ask you as well about the importance of new legislation or different regulatory measures for public bodies and agencies. And David asks, is it anticipated that any new agencies would require legislation to bring things like compulsory sales orders into existence and give them the powers to actually make a difference? I wonder if, Hanna, you've got any thoughts on, say, the public land agency idea?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm not 100% sure about the kind of legislative background of some of those claims, but I do know like the Commission has done significant bits of work on this, and there are a number of reports that it would be worth having a look at on the website, and David might be able to point to some of the more specific ones. Also, it's definitely worth pointing out that, as David mentioned in the chat, the Scottish Government are due to be consulting on compulsory purchase orders later this year, and it's definitely worth feeding into those consultations with also some of the kind of recommendations around compulsory sales orders too, as a vehicle for that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I'm going to stick with the theme of public sector powers, and I want to talk a bit about planning actually. It came up earlier, strategic land use planning, and I think it'd be interesting to know what the panel thinks about the role of planners in supporting land reform measures. We talked about local place plans and other kinds of mechanisms, but yes, I wonder if any of you have got some thoughts on that. Who wants to take that? Ewan?
Yes, it does. It can. Planning is under-resourced. Planners are required to meet a whole host of strategic aims. And I suppose my reference to master plans requiring something additional in them is a reflection of that, in that we're looking at sites to deliver all sorts of things, as well as developers to make a contribution to wider public benefits. But within that, particularly in reference to climate change and community growing, the requirement within spatial land allocation to provide those things meet other wider aims of the local authority beyond the actual regulatory planning system. So if you are providing growing space, if you are providing orchards, which are mentioned in the chat, it's meeting a wider aim for the whole local authority. But planning is the mechanism that needs to make that a requirement, without it being a requirement that developers can buy their way out of. Because spatially it's important that those things are accessible to people, but it requires planning to be resourced and for the planning officers to be supported in enforcing those things. To me, there's a bit of an absence of looking at development, post-development, to see is everything being delivered around that development that was required in the conditions of the planning consent. And we often see people complaining about the fact that things are not being delivered, or that it's taking far too long for it to be delivered. And that's a reflection of the under-resourcing of the system. And I know nobody, to say you want to give more money to planning when money is short seems maybe unappealing politically. But I suppose that also reflects on a political desire in leadership to see substantive change around land reform. Is that still there? Or have things, the events that I go to where politicians speak, it's all about political, it's all about economic growth, which doesn't seem to take into some of the things that the people in this call are probably interested in. And so I'm wondering where the political vision for this is in the next Parliament.
Carey, did you want to come in?
Yeah, my research looks at how communities engage with land use planning and land sort of widely defined. And generally from communities' perspective, they don't see a difference really between land use planning and land reform and community right to buy. It's usually people thinking about what's happening with the land at the end of their street and how they can make something happen. Which means it can be quite confusing to understand, like, why do they need to do a local place plan or a community right to buy application and how those fit together, for example, and what would the outcomes be. And I say that because I think that planning is central to all of this, but it needs to be more streamlined from the perspective of the lay person engaging with this. And I think the fact that it's so complicated and confusing is one of the reasons why you end up with public outcry about democratic deficits when planning applications are being made, because local people, community councils, for example, who have a role in the planning system, maybe, at that piece, it's hard for them to see how democracy is being exercised in the public interest over decisions about land use. And that is really difficult and quite powerful when it really kicks off. So I think we need to work on that and improve it. So again, planning is central to all these discussions, in my opinion.
Thank you. Would anyone like to come in? Anyone in the audience with any comments or question for the panel? If you do, please just raise your hand. I had a question linked to, I think, your point about sort of access to land and transparency. I'll come to you in a minute, Stuart. Thanks. I was just wondering what the panel thinks about access to land and available data to actually get in touch with landowners or make decisions around tax and planning. Do you have thoughts on that? Where do we need to go in terms of data and transparency?
Andy Whiteman should answer that question. But it's not transparent enough. The land register is accessible, but it's not complete. And it doesn't then give you any means to kind of contact who's owning it. And as Andy's work shows, even if it does give a title of somebody who owns land, it can be completely opaque as to how you access them. So there's still, to me, the land register is something that through my old job at Built Environment Scotland and through the work we did on tenement stuff, became really interested in and saw huge potential in what the basic information on the land register, which, if aligned with other bits of information around land use and land ownership, could be absolutely brilliant. But we seem to be miles away from meeting the potential that has.
I think, Hanna, you were next with your hand.
Yeah, just to kind of add to that, in my previous role at the Land Commission as a researcher, one of the things I was doing was working on our rural land market reports, so trying to analyse data from the registers of Scotland to draw a picture of what's happening in the rural land market specifically. And coming up against all sorts of issues with that data, various things like not having price paid included for many sites, and also sort of Andy and I have discussed like that might be actually where some sales are trying to obscure how much a piece of land has been sold for, particularly with sort of high profile, large or like high value sales. And it makes it really difficult to sort of research and understand what's happening in the land market. But also, yeah, Kathy, part of your question was around tax, I think. And like, there's all sorts of bits of information that are missing for us to really develop like credible policy around tax and around land reform. And linked to what Ewan's just said, like there are all sorts of different pockets of data, and linking them together would be fantastic, but is a huge challenge. And so, yeah, data and transparency is clearly like a very big issue in rural and urban land reform.
Thanks. Carey, do you want to comment on that question?
Yeah, just to say that completing the land reform was one of my headline recommendations. Didn't make the shortlist, but it was on there. And in urban Scotland, what you have is land fragmentation in particular, as well as options to develop land being much more widespread. The Land Commission did some research on options a few years ago, and that is very much predominantly an urban issue. Options are important for transparency. If there's an option on land, you can't do a community right to buy, which is where communities run up against it. There's probably changes which can be made to the title system, which will be quicker than completing the land register, like requiring options to be on the title, which occurs elsewhere in the UK. Could talk about land register for quite some time, but I'll stop.
For another session, maybe. At this point, I just want to go to our second and final poll while Stuart gets ready to unmute himself and ask his question. Over to you, Stuart.
Yeah, it's just a quick question about compulsory sales orders. And I'm sort of speaking on behalf of the Royal and Corporation Architects in Scotland. I think we're seeing a lot of assets that are out there that need to be in better hands, but they're just sitting there and the councils won't take on the compulsory purchase because they can't afford to do it. Is that actually going to happen? Is there an appetite, if it does happen, for councils to start using those powers? Are the people there to drive that?
Is that directed at anyone in particular?
Whoever's best on the panel that could cover that point.
I mean, I can say a little bit, but yeah, I know, Carey, you might have your hand up for that one. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think we know that obviously compulsory purchase order legislation is old, complex, archaic. People really struggle with understanding how to use it, and there's a lack of like sort of confidence, I think. So although there are some powers to use it, it is rarely used, is my understanding. I think somebody on this call was telling me that Glasgow City Council have started using it a little bit more. But there are real issues with it, and that's widely recognised and is why Scottish Government are consulting on it. In terms of like how likely the compulsory sales orders stuff are to sort of take off. I mean, in some ways, it's kind of an easier proposal because it just involves the public body acting as the kind of like auctioneer. So as I mentioned when I was doing my bit at the beginning, it wouldn't involve like, you know, the Scottish Land Agency that I was talking about would require significant funding in setting up, but with compulsory sales orders, it would be the public sector acting as a kind of auctioneer in selling the land, so wouldn't require them buying it. And I do think in that sense is potentially politically more feasible in the kind of current fiscal situation. But yeah, I that's as far as I know about that. So yeah, open to hearing from anyone else who knows more.
Great, unless anyone else wants to comment on that point. Thanks, Hannah, for handling that question. Really useful response. Andy, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just wondering, when we're talking about urban land reform, the cities are not the same as towns, and it seems to me that the challenges facing Aberdeen, Dundee, Glasgow, Edinburgh, and I suppose some of the other larger towns, maybe Inverness, Perth and places, are very, very different from the challenges facing, you know, the 150, 160, 200 towns, you know, Stranraer, Kirkcaldy, Peterhead, Portree, Wick. And we kind of need to look at them a bit separately. I mean, it strikes me that much of the land reform agenda for towns could be delivered by enhanced democracy and agency. In other words, their ability to do things on their own account for their own town. Whereas the capacity and agency for cities is much more to do with sort of larger, I would say, projects and bigger powers, more strategic planning powers. That's not to say that communities within those cities can't have agency as well, but it seems to me we need to think about these things separately sometimes.
Would anyone on the panel like to reflect on that?
I'm happy to, in light of the fact that Democracy Matters, the Scottish Government-led project that's been rumbling on for years. We had Democracy Matters two years ago, and there's a advisory group working on a publication that should come out next month. I'm not on the advisory group. I have had sight of it, and this is about giving more democracy at a local level. I don't think it will. It's looking at creating a new layer of a community body that's got self-selected people from organizations on it. It doesn't sound democratic to me. Resource is referred to, but it doesn't say where the resource comes from. But this is the next level in developing local democracy. It doesn't talk, and it's also about self-defined areas. So whether or not a town, a former borough town decides to be one of those, or whether or not you have a neighbourhood that wants to set this up, and the idea would be it would be responsible for delivering a community action plan. I find that what I've seen so far, I find highly unsatisfactory. I've been very interested in this, through Scottish Community Alliance. I've been trying to push for enhanced community councils with resource and more power, or collectives of community councils working together, which would answer some of the the Peterhead places. But even within towns that are around larger neighbourhoods to come together, the self-selecting nature of it, to me, ultimately, could deepen inequality where you get well-off areas deciding to not partner with the poorer neighbourhood next door. But that is the government. The government are doing something around this, but it's not substantive, and it doesn't address local taxation and things like that, which I think need to be part of that because it's difficult. And I understand that it's difficult, but it's not setting a long-term vision, and it should be setting a very difficult long-term vision to work towards to address those local democracy issues. But there doesn't seem to be a political appetite for that, while acknowledging that there is a problem. But to me, the answer that I think we'll be seeing coming out in the next few months isn't the answer.
Interesting political will came up as sort of the strong response there in the last poll. So that chimes with what you're saying, Ewan. Carey, Hanna, any thoughts on that?
Well, I just echo what Andy said, and just to sort of make the strong case that we talk about the housing crisis, but it really is a set of multiple crises that all are so specific to the local area or the city or even the region within the city that they're speaking to, and that's for a whole host of different reasons. So I think that's a fair point from Andy, that we should think about cities and towns differently, because there are real different levers and opportunities in those.
Thanks, Hanna. I actually think this links really nicely to what will probably be the last question. We've got about 5 minutes left, from Lindsay Chalmers, which is about how can we raise awareness of the potential of land reform in urban areas. So it wasn't included in the land reform bill. Is the term land reform relevant in that context? Be really interested in your thoughts on that. Who would like to go first? Or anyone in the audience want to have a go? Andy?
Yeah, I put a comment in the chat. I mean, I think it's important to focus on the things that matter to people. So potentially the biggest land reform coming forward in urban areas is tenement law reform. It will affect hundreds of thousands of people who, for the first time, hopefully, if the Law Commission and government introduce legislation to this effect, will give people a degree of certainty and confidence moving forward. Will put more resources into the urban fabric of tenements, and will ensure that there's much more transparency in land transactions, because people will know the condition of things they're buying, and long term will improve our urban realm. So I think it's really important to kind of focus on the things, as I say, that matter to people, because I think, as one of the speakers said earlier, I think it was Carey, about how people think about land. They think about land as a place that they care about. They don't think in words like planning and land reform and tax. They don't think in those words. They think about places. So I think we need to think about how we use language and how we make it relevant to people. And my challenge to politicians in the past has been, when you pass a piece of legislation that you're calling land reform, you need to be able to go on the radio or the television afterwards and metaphorically point to people and say, this is going to benefit you, and you. That's how you build support, by making it relevant to people.
Thanks, Andy. Willie, would you like to come in on that?
Unmute. Yeah, look, Willie Rutherglen, Scottish Enterprise. So my main involvement in this is in our role as landowner, and I think it's fair to say that we have a fair bit of vacant and derelict land within our portfolio. My point is a little bit more general, though. It's just really an observation around the terminology and land reform. Because really, I think when you say that, it means different things to different people. And if you're going to try and improve the property and land market, there are separate strands to it. There's the land use, currently, historically, and in planning terms. There's the all the technicality and mystery and finance around land ownership, who gets to own land, who gets to decide who owns what bits of land. So that's where your compulsory purchase and compulsory sales order starts to play in. And then you've got the mechanics and the economics, I guess, of land development, which can be, a very good end use. But the problem is that the land's currently zoned for a higher value use. And therefore that's, I think I'd put a comment in earlier about the disconnect between land value and land price. I'll cite an example here in the industrial land market. Industrial land changes hands at rates per acre that make the development of that land for industrial space unviable. But it still happens. So within the land development markets, there's a lot of complexity and there's a lot of scope for unintended consequences coming out of legislative change. I think we're probably still living the legacy of the Land Compensation Scotland's Act 63 and 73. So I guess my plea is, don't sit alone in your bit of all this ecosystem or whatever, because the answer doesn't lie in any one part of it. It's a balance and a blend of the conflicting, because they are conflicting, aspirations, demands, barriers, penalties, problems of those three strands of the issue that you're trying to address. Anyway, that's my observation for what it's worth.
Yeah, thank you for that. Really, really useful. And we didn't really get to talk about land values as much as I'd like, but this is definitely something the Commission is really interested in, and that disconnect between price and value, and that links to tax, that links to public land ownership, and making housing affordable as well. But Ewan and Carey, I'll give you the final word. So I'll hand over to Carey first and then to Ewan.
I was going to answer the question around how do we raise the awareness of the potential of land reform in urban areas. I think we need to go farther than raising awareness. I think, there's a lot of interest in the topic. The conversation today has been really rich. We need concrete steps. I think we probably need a manifesto for urban land reform. Can the Commission do that, or a strategy? Because you can't do manifestos, but a strategy setting out some steps about this. I love that term the last speaker gave us about, the ecosystem of land reform and all the different things across it that all work together to deliver it. Let's not forget that, it's a pleasure to do the work in Scotland because we have land reform and we all agree that we can be changing these systems in the public interest. And that's great. That's a great place to be, but we need to grasp that opportunity to make some changes on this.
An action there for the Commission, I think. Thanks, Ewan.
As part of my work, I look regularly at local place plans, and what I read in local place plans is a high percentage, more than 50% of it, is not spatial. It's about management and condition. That local people are responding to things that they're unhappy with, be it vacant land, but it may not be as severe as vacant land, but it's still something that they see as blighting their community. We have a whole host of stuff within legislation in local authorities that talks about blight and how blight can be handled, and it doesn't happen. One of the reasons communities get involved in certain sites is because it's blighting their community, and so they want ownership of it so that they can then do something about it. But actually, the responsibility should lie with the landowner, but we're not punitive of it. And I think a couple of years ago, I was at the equivalent of Scotland's Towns Partnerships English body in London, and it was a different world. And I was on a panel with somebody representing Grosvenor Estates around the Grosvenor Estate in London. So this is old family money, long term, and they've owned it for hundreds of years. and it's high value and they lease it out, but they are, as a landowner, they are punitive on their tenants. If their tenants do anything they don't like, they fine them. If they see anything that is neglect, they fine them. So it maintains a standard in a very high value part of London. So I'm not saying it's directly comparable, but the reason their tenants maintain high standards is because the landowner is punitive. But we're not particularly punitive. It's rare that fines are issued, and it's rare that land that is blighting is then, and it's a problem because a lot of that vacant derelict land may be in the ownership of the public sector. But we often look to create carrots, but actually I still wonder if being more punitive to people who neglect land and blight communities is one of the things that an avenue that we need to look further at.
Thanks. A very sort of provocative final comment, and something that, yeah, we're definitely alive to in our various bits of policy work and urban land reform. So we're just over time. I thank you all so much for participating, for all the great comments and questions in the chat. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's comments, but we'd really like you to fill out the survey on Scotland futures and where we go next. Anything that we didn't capture today, please do fill in the form. You've got a few more weeks to do that. It'll be sent out to you as well after this call finishes. But yeah, thank you so much to the panel, Ewan, Carey and Hannah. It's been extremely rich, and yeah, look forward to speaking more about urban land reform with you wherever we meet next. Thank you all. Have a good evening.